can we talk about demographics? As you know, some people say demographics is destiny. We've got the one-child policy and its impact, and then you've got a divide mirrored around the world in various different ways between young versus old as well. Can you just talk about the different forces playing on the Chinese economy?
Well, first of all, I have a little bit of a contrarian view when it comes to aging and demographics, and I just don't think this is the first-order challenge for China. I think the first-order challenge for China is if they give up the pro-growth agenda, as I mentioned. But I don't think demographics is. And here, let me tell you why. First of all, just looking across countries, there's been some recent, very robust and serious academic studies that have shown that demographic aging causing a slowdown in growth and reduction in per capita income was true before 1990. That relationship completely reversed after 1990. Why? The arrival of technology and automation. And so aging countries tend to adopt these technologies more rapidly and also spread them across different sectors. So actually, Asian countries became the richer countries after the post-1990 sample. Now, China accounts for about 50% of industrial robot exports. Were China really concerned about the reduction in labor force? Very, very quickly, they can replace a labor force with robotics. And by the way, there's still a massive number of undereducated rural population whose wages are way below the market rates that they can tap into. So in the end, it's really about productivity. It's about labor productivity, it's about productivity, it's about how to engage with things like new technologies like AI, which is going to displace labor anyways. It's not so much the number of people in the population. So if demographics didn't explain China on the way up, I doubt that it was explain China on the way down.
You've also written about your generation, the generation born in, the 80s, the 90s, the noughties, being a distinct break from the past. Another generation will come along. Do you sense another break coming, or do you think there is more continuity because the system has shifted already?
China currently has, probably my generation and post-90s compared to my parents' generation, probably represents the biggest generational gap in China. Yeah. But I really think that the new generation will change the economic and potentially political landscape for China. So my parents' generation, through all the hardship, they're risk averse. They are massive savers. All the international controversies that we've had with China exporting too much or saving too much, well, that's about to change with the new generation. 85% of domestic consumer credit is accounted by 35 and under.
Right.
University students have no hesitation, despite having no income. One click on Taobao, which is Alibaba's e-commerce website, borrow the money to buy a lipstick. Huh. I don't know how they repay. Maybe their parents are paying it back, but they are a borrowing, spending generation. Huge amount of spending, focus on apparel, entertainment, leisure, traveling. Unlike their saving, parents. And by the way, why is it? It's a puzzle that I write in my book about how is it that an average young 20-something, early 30-something person can afford apartments at San Francisco prices when the average income in that city is about a tenth of San Francisco income. Well, there are 6 wallets behind the 20-something person, that person's spouse and their parents, and maybe the grandparents would all chip in. So we got to take into account the fact that culture also plays a role and maybe changes the Chinese families. But most importantly, I like to talk about the new generation of the Chinese because it's not just the consumption habits, the economic landscape. They're extremely open-minded. Many of them have studied abroad. Something like, 500,000 students go abroad to study every year. They come back and they try to change the economic landscape and try to be entrepreneurial. All the international surveys show that they care about things like animal rights, diversity, likes to have diversity, very open religiously, and so to many, many other things, very much unlike the previous generations. So I think in terms of talking about the East and West and US and China, all that, they will be a better bridge between China and the rest of the world. And I think there's much more of a convergence between the millennials or the Gen Zs between China and the rest of the world than the previous generations.
You talk about the risk of veering away from the pro-growth agenda. Can you expand upon that? I mean, there will be some who think Why on earth would anyone veer away from the pro-growth agenda when it's done so well?
Yeah, well, see, I remember a few weeks ago I was talking to somebody, I don't know, in their 60s, and he was telling me in the 1980s, he was just utterly shocked when the country announced that the priority is now going to be on the economy and growth. So we really take it for granted, thinking that, of course, that's what everybody wants, right? Having seen all this. But back then, back in China then, it should be about ideology, it should be about politics. Growth, economy, what's that for, And so that 40 years of focus on economic growth, everything, putting in everything to make sure that they ensure growth is really one of the first layer of why, first fundamental force of why China has become successful. Now, it's also the case, and the fact that many countries, when they get to a certain level of income, they also drop the pro-growth agenda. Populist governments, they start to think about, redistribution, but not in the right ways, not in the economically feasible and effective ways. I don't think China is going there, but there's always, but now there's, security, right? National security concerns. Of course, there's rising geopolitics. You always somehow fear that economic is no longer front and center. But here I want to point out that in China, it's a pendulum swing, that the goals often shift depending on the circumstances of the day. Now, there was a lot of confidence pre-pandemic, but after, and especially in the last couple of years where the economy has really slid, you can see visibly that pragmatism has returned. And I always say that there's more Mao in times of confidence, but Deng in times of a crisis. So Deng Xiaoping, more pragmatism. You've seen a slew of policies coming out recently supporting the private sector, so kind of rolling back some of the regulatory crackdowns we've seen in the past. There have been massive efforts to open up the economy, to lure back capital. I mean, even something small like visa-free travel, something that China has never done, just meant to lure back, kind of get foreigners to come back, showing to the world, signaling that China is open for business. These are very practical measures, but that's only been recent.
You also write a growing consciousness, you write of a growing consciousness that what is economically efficient may not be socially desirable. And that presumably is pushing back on the pro-growth agenda.
Absolutely. This is going to be a very important agenda still going forward. There's several angles to look at this. First is, in China, some leaders believe that China should not be looking more and more like the US, in particular where politics sing to the tunes of capital. They rather like it the other way around, where there's obviously massive inequality and divisiveness and the chaos, kind of the angst, the social angst that has caused many American citizens. Why do we see many crackdowns on technology companies, on education companies? Now there's recently something about gaming, because I think it's a journey to find out, can there be less inequality? Can there be more inclusive growth? Can the big techs behave and think about protect consumers? I mean, all of that, we're sympathetic to that because that's something that the world has talked about. But China has done it faster and implemented a lot of these policies faster than other countries. Now, not to say that these are the right things to do or the right ways to implement them, but I think the agenda of expanding beyond just economic growth to think about social equity and social harmony is going to be one of the defining features going forward.
You touched on the sort of backlash, in particular from the US. A couple of big examples has been Huawei, more recently TikTok, and the demand from Congress that it be separated from any relationship with the Chinese company. Aside from stimulating domestic growth in these industries, what do you think the impact will be?
Well, people ask me, what is the China model? And I said, just read Jake Sullivan's speech on how to restore American competitiveness, and there you get the China model. It looks pretty. The U.S. is looking more and more like China, and China also tries to copy U.S. free markets. We've seen these massive Chips and Science Acts, Inflation Reduction Acts, hundreds of billions of dollars of industrial policies. And by the way, China did not invent industrial policies. If you look at it in the data, actually the richer countries are more aggressive users of industrial policies, but certainly we've seen a return, even with Europe. Even with Japan, that's allocated hundreds of billions of dollars to restore a Japanese kind of high tech, or focus on Japanese high tech. So we're seeing rising protectionism, an arms race, industrial policies, and so this is also coming back to your first question, a little bit worrying about what that kind of global landscape would start to look like. But the TikTok issue, yes, now it's the question is, can we really keep the small yard, high fence strategy, right? Because as we mentioned, now the majority of technologies or high tech are going to be dual use. Is it going to include EVs? Now we've seen the recent increase in tariffs in EVs. Is it going to overflow to lots of other consumer products? So this is it might be a vicious circle where we're headed.